Hello! Next up is Aristotle, who lived from about 384 to about 322 BCE, also in ancient Greece. We've already looked at Socrates and Plato, and Aristotle is the next person in this lineage. He was a student at Plato's Academy, he was the prize student at Plato's Academy, and he went on to establish himself as one of the most important people who ever lived. And everybody who we've looked at so far, everybody we're going to continue to look at, these people have all obviously had a very big impact on the world and on philosophy and on their societies, which is why we're still talking about them and their ideas. But it's probably almost impossible to overestimate the amount of influence that Aristotle in particular has had on the Western world. Certainly, probably more than anybody else we're going to talk about. And it would be hard to find a whole lot of people who have made as much of an impact on our thought and on our world as he has. And you might have found yourself reading this chapter and reading certain things and thinking, well, duh. I mean, obviously, this just seems like common sense. Everybody thinks Aristotle's like this great, smart guy, but really all this is just common sense. Well, it's not. And nobody was saying those things or thinking those things at the time that Aristotle was writing them. They were considered to be very controversial and not at all the prevailing ideas and sentiments at the time. The reason why it seems obvious now is because of how much Aristotle influenced the way that we still look at the world. And one of the reasons for this is because the Roman Empire was a really big fan of Aristotle and his views on philosophy and science and all these other things were sort of the prevailing intellectualism. And it was considered almost as blasphemous to question and contradict his views as it was the views of the Roman Catholic Church and of the Bible. And you're going to see how this is really interesting of a matchup because Aristotle's going to contradict a lot of the stuff that you would presuppose would be very important to Catholicism. And we're going to get to that shortly. So it's sometimes said that Aristotle halted the progression of mankind for about 1600 years. And in some ways it's true in the sense that Aristotle was wrong about a lot, and therefore a lot of people were wrong for a very long period of time about these things because everybody just assumed that Aristotle was right. On the other hand, this is a very unfair claim because it's certainly not Aristotle's fault. As somebody who was a philosopher and who was somebody searching for the truth always, he would have not wanted anybody to just blindly follow whatever he had to say, but would have wanted people to continue to try to find the truth in the areas that he was wrong in. And there's a lot that Aristotle was completely right about. There's a lot that he gave us that we still use, essentially a bare bones version of what would become the scientific method. He's often considered to be the father of science as we know it as a field. And he was right about a lot of other things depending on who you ask. So a lot of people still consider themselves to be Aristotelian in regards to ethics or psychology or something like that. And then there was a lot that he was just totally wrong about, particularly in regards to science and anatomy and astronomy and all sorts of other things that, yeah, of course he was wrong. We're talking about somebody who lived more than 300 years before the year zero. Of course, his scientific ideas were miscalculated in a lot of areas. So here's just to give you one example. Before we talk about all the really great things he had to say, let's look at a really bad thing. He thought that if I imagined a cow, for instance, that there was actually a mini physical cow that would appear in my heart when I was thinking about a cow. Now, it seems like we can tell that all of our thought takes place in our brains, but that's an entirely psychological thing because people didn't really realize that the brain was important for much of anything until 1500 years after Aristotle, even farther than that. People of the ancient world almost universally believed that all of your thought takes place in your heart. And the brain was completely discounted. For the majority of human history, the brain has been thought of as relatively unimportant. The Egyptians would remove it when they mummified a body, didn't bother to put it back in. They didn't think it was important for people to have in their journey into the underworld after their death. And it's not surprising to think about why, because you can really, especially back then, only observe a brain after a person's dead. And a dead brain looks pretty unimpressive. It's sort of like soft, gray, wrinkly tofu. And it doesn't really look like it does a whole lot. Certainly doesn't look like it's the center of everything that you are and everything that you do and everything that you're capable of and everything that you feel and believe and all these other things that we know it to be the center of now. So obviously, Aristotle was wrong about a lot of things, but not about everything. So there's a lot of really important things that are worth talking about. And I had showed you before my complete works of Plato and commented about how much Plato wrote. And this is the complete works of Aristotle, Volume 1. There are 2 of these, and they're both like 1,700 pages. So I have no idea how Aristotle had the time to be able to write all of this. And again, as I mentioned with Plato, miraculous that this much of it survived. And within the last decade, they found some original works by Aristotle in a landfill in Greece that nobody had ever found and nobody ever knew about. They're still discovering things that this dude wrote all these years later, which is extraordinary. So let's get into some of the things that I want to point out about Aristotle. So we had talked about how Socrates really didn't care about being attractive and having a good appearance and how he made fun of himself. And Plato sort of rejected this elite birthright that put him in a state of prestige in the Athenian world. Aristotle is going to be counter to this sort of lackadaisical attitude about appearance. And Aristotle's going to care a lot about not only his physical appearance, but how other people view him. And he got a lot of attention at the Academy, not just for his superior intellect, but also because he was very vain and very concerned about the way that other people viewed him. He spent a lot of time on his clothing and his physical appearance, which not a lot of people were concerned about at the all-male academy. He also spoke with a lisp on purpose, because back then people from more wealthy, highly regarded families would speak with a lisp intentionally to appear to be superior, which seems interesting to us now because people tend to view lisps as speech impediments that should be corrected. But this just shows you the cultural framework on this sort of thing. So in the same way that we think certain accents sound very intelligent and high class, and we think other accents have a negative connotation, the same sort of a thing. Aristotle really wanted people to think that he was from this great background, and he wasn't. And it turned out he didn't need it to be ultimately extremely successful. So at the beginning of Aristotle's philosophical journey, he agreed with Plato about just about everything, which makes sense. He learned from Plato. And think about your earliest education. You probably believed everything the teacher told you was true. You maybe still do in some of your classes. But by the time Aristotle was doing his own writing and founding his own school and all of these other things, he opened the Lyceum, which was essentially the rival for Plato's Academy. After Plato died, Aristotle expected to take over the Academy since he was the star pupil and he was Plato's favorite, but because he wasn't actually born in Athens, he was born on an island that was part of Greece, but Greece wasn't all unified at the time in the way that it is now. He was viewed suspiciously as sort of a foreigner, and they didn't want to put him in charge of the school, so he got a little bit salty about it and went and started his own rival institution called the Lyceum. By the time he was doing things like this, he pretty much disagreed with Plato about just about everything. So it's an interesting contrast to look at the different ways that they look at the world, and obviously the difference in form is going to be one of the biggest parts of this chapter and this video and this discussion. So before we get to that, after he opened the Lyceum, he worked for Alexander the Great. He was a political advocate. He founded logic. He founded science. He started the world's first big library. He did all of these things. And he ended up getting charged with essentially the same thing that Socrates was charged with. And unlike Socrates, who went to trial, who defended himself, who refused to apologize and exile himself and chose to die for philosophy, Aristotle chose the option that was definitely more popular with ancient Athenians, and that was to admit that what he did was wrong, apologize, and exile himself. And he did that. He justified this by saying that he didn't want Athens to sin twice against philosophy. And so he just said, my bad, and he got out of there. So it's up to you whether or not you think that that was a more intelligent route than Socrates, or whether you think it was a cop-out, or however you feel about that life choice. So, Aristotle's big overarching thing that we're going to talk about here, clearly he was talking about a lot of stuff that's not dealt with in this very short chapter, so feel free to email me if you'd like recommendations about anything else that he did talk about, was naturalism, which is the idea that the only things that exist are physical objects in a physical world that are governed by fundamental physical laws. Now, here's one of those things that a lot of people nowadays, especially if you're more scientifically minded, will say, duh, Aristotle. No shit. We know that. Well, think of the world that Aristotle was writing in. Think of Plato and the forms, which are real and never changing, but they don't exist in space. They don't exist in time. They're not physical objects. They don't exist in our world. They exist in the realm of the forms, which is a very real place, but it's not a physical thing. Aristotle's going to say no. Simply because I can think about this sort of mental conception of a form doesn't mean that that thing is real. I can also think of a unicorn or a zombie or an alien. That doesn't mean any of those things are real either, simply because I can think about it and I can talk about it as if it was a real thing. So naturalism is going to reject pretty much the entirety of Plato's worldview. But it's going to do even more than that. Because it's also going to reject, think of how in ancient Greece they had multiple gods and goddesses who had special realms that they operated in, who had all sorts of magical qualities and abilities that didn't consist of physical objects in a physical world. You had an idea of an immortal soul that existed before and after your physical body was born and died. There were a lot of things being believed at the time that weren't physical objects in the physical world being governed by fundamental physical laws. Now, here's also, this was long before Christianity, but you can see how this is an interesting choice for the Roman Empire to make, because the Roman Catholic Church and Christianity in general relies on the belief of all sorts of things that don't exist as physical objects in a physical world bound by fundamental physical laws. The very idea of God is a contradiction to all of this, as well as the immortal soul and heaven and miracles and probably angels and demons, right? I mean, there's all sorts of things that seem to be vital parts of the Catholic worldview that don't go along with naturalism here at all. So you have a very big part of philosophy and science after Aristotle that was essentially trying to reconcile Aristotle's viewpoints with Catholic viewpoints. And that's the majority of what was happening philosophically during the Roman Empire. And you have some, so we're going to skip a couple of chapters here, you have some information here about people like St. Thomas Aquinas, who's probably the most famous thinker to try to make these sorts of reconciliations, to take the logic and rationality of Aristotle, the scientific ideas, and to make them consistent with a Christian worldview and Christian beliefs, which is not really easy to do, which is why that was sort of the full-time job of thinkers at the time. So after Aristotle, we're skipping over a couple of chapters. I invite you to read them, especially if you're interested. If you want a detailed discussion of arguments for God's existence and the attempts to prove God's existence using rationality and science and Aristotle and those sorts of things, I highly recommend reading St. Thomas Aquinas in here for that information. But we're going to skip all the way to Descartes, which is essentially skipping almost 1,600 years, because there just wasn't a whole lot that was happening at that time because of Aristotle's mental dominance over the world, which is staggering when you think about it. So, naturalism. The only thing that exists are physical objects in a physical world that are governed by fundamental physical laws. And here was the part that was particularly new with Aristotle. I mean, the whole rejection was pretty significant, and you can see why he was charged with speaking against the gods with naturalism for sure. But the whole fundamental physical law thing was a very big thing too. And Aristotle's going to come out and say, and of course this applies to humans. Humans throughout all of our history, we've always thought we were more important than we were. We've always thought that we were the most important things on the planet, superior to other animal species, superior to plant life, superior to the planet itself. We're a very selfish species, and we think very highly of ourselves. Nothing's changed in that regard. But Aristotle is going to say, no, we're really not that special. We're special in the sense that we're highly intelligent and capable of rationality and all of these other things. But we're still physical objects in a physical world, and we're still bound by the same fundamental physical laws as everything else. We don't get a pass on, gravity and thermodynamics and all of these things. Obviously, Aristotle wouldn't have used that as an example in his time period, but we're just physical systems too, albeit we have a lot more mental power than a lot of other physical systems in the world. So, remember for Plato, we had form with a capital F. Change in the physical world was the big problem here that led Plato to come up with the forms. Physical objects are always changing, so knowledge is impossible, because I might think that I know, but it's going to change. And if it changes, it's not really knowledge, and it's not really truth, it's just opinion. And if everything is just opinion, that has dangerous consequences. So instead, Plato just took the idea of truth and knowledge and put it outside of our physical world and put it in a place where it never changes, and it's always permanent, and it's always true. Well, Aristotle's going to say that that is totally unnecessary. So he's going to, instead of looking at saying here's a physical world that's changing and then there's this form thing that exists independently of that physical objects participate in, he's going to say that all there is the physical stuff, and that all of it is formed matter. So the matter part, this is something you probably learned in elementary school science. The matter part is whatever the physical object is made out of. So the matter here would be ceramic. And this matter is paper. So we have the matter, which is the physical object, or the physical building blocks of an object. And for Aristotle, the form, right, the formed matter, the form is not some abstract, never-changing, non-spatial temporal entity like Plato thought it was. For Aristotle, form, lowercase f here, is just the form of the thing, the shape of it, whatever it looks like. You take the matter, you take the physical stuff, and you form it, you shape it into whatever it's going to look like. So this is, the matter is ceramic, and the form is a cylindrical coffee cup drinking vessel. The matter is paper, wood pulp, whatever is used to construct this, and then the form would be a rectangular notepad, right? Same thing with the wood in the form of a bookshelf. So everything is formed matter. Now, Plato thought that form existed independently of all physical objects, but Aristotle's going to say no. You can never encounter form without matter, because you can never encounter the shape of an object without it being made out of something, even if it's just a computer simulation, right? There's still matter. It's the image you're looking at is still a physical image made out of physical things. You're never, according to Aristotle, just going to have a form of chair without having a physical object that is a chair. So we can have form, we have matter, but the two go together, because the alternate is true as well. You're never going to encounter form without matter attached to it, and you're never going to encounter matter that doesn't have a form. Even if it's a pile of rubble, it's still in a form of a pile. You're not going to encounter physical building blocks that don't represent some sort of a shape. They have to. It's an object. It takes up space. It has some sort of shape. So this is going to allow Aristotle to talk about how objects change, because the form can change. For Plato, it never did. But for Aristotle, the form can change. So I could take a piece of this paper, which is a rectangular piece of paper, and I can fold it, or I can crumple it, or I can set it on fire and burn it. All of this, it'll still be matter. It'll still be wood pulp and adhesives, but it will have a different form now, right? So now this is a different form. This is the form of a small ball, as opposed to the form of a rectangular flat sheet. Same thing with my bookshelf. I could hack it into pieces if I wanted to. I could set it on fire. I could douse it with chemicals. I could do whatever destructive thing that I might choose to do to it, and the form of it will change. It will still consist of wood or sawdust if I run it through a wood chipper, but the form will change. It'll have the same matter, just in a different configuration. So Aristotle said that change is just a series of small alterations to the form that the object is in. It's not like all of a sudden now it's this whole new thing. It's a small series of changes in the form of it until we have something in a different form than it was before. But you still have the matter. That hasn't changed. So, Aristotle thought, instead of contemplating the forms like Plato did and having that be our focus of how to get knowledge, Aristotle's going to say, you don't need to do any of that. Everything that you need is right here in the physical world. You just need to know how to ask the right questions. And Aristotle was one of the first Westerner at least, who came out and said, look, you don't really need to think about all these abstract, weird ideas in order to find out about something. You look at the physical object in the physical world and you ask physical questions about its physicality, and that's how you get to know objects. And that's one of those things that to us now we think, well, obviously, how else would I get to know an object? But again, that's just because of how much Aristotle has influenced the way that we do approach knowledge. So, Aristotle said that to get to know an object, we ask 4 questions, or we find out what the 4 causes of the object are. So first we have the material cause. That's the matter. What is it made out of? Is it made out of wood? Is it made out of ceramic? Is it made out of steel? Is it made out of paper and wood pulp? If it's a natural object, what is it made of? So a human is made out of flesh and bone and blood. A plant-like object is made out of chlorophyll and whatever else. I'm not a botanist. So everything is made out of some sort of matter. That's the first thing that we need to ask. What's the material cause of this object? And then the formal cause. That's the form part, the formed matter. So it seems weird to say what's the formal cause and then to say drinking vessel. But that's essentially what it is. What form is that matter in? What's the shape of it? In this case, my flesh and bone, that's the material cause, and I'm in the form of an adult female or a human, if we're being generic, however you want to say it. Obviously, my dog is also flesh and bone and blood, the same sorts of matter, but she's in her formal cause. She's in the form of a cute little dog, not a human. In the same way that most plants are probably made out of the same sort of material causes, their formal cause will be different if it's my tiny little bamboo over there versus a giant tree out in the yard. So those are the first two causes, and then we want to ask the efficient cause. And this is essentially the question of, how did that thing get here? So if it's a man-made object, it's going to be a story about how somebody decided to make a large adhesive notepad that could be torn off, whatever, and they decided and they figured out how to make it. If it's a natural object, that's going to be a little bit different as far as figuring out, how did that get there? So how did this giant hole get in this rock? Well, water made its path through there over so many years and eroded the rock just so, and so now you have this hole, and the efficient cause would be the water flowing through it, right? Something like that. How did out in the Midwest you see a lot of fields, right? And sometimes there's those are the business called volunteer corn. You'll see a field that's either empty or maybe soybeans or something, and there'll be random corn stalks. Okay, well, what's the efficient cause of those? How did those get there? Well, an animal ate corn kernels and went to the bathroom in that field, and there was enough fertilization and water and sunlight in the soil that those seeds grew into a corn stalk. So the deer would be the efficient cause of that random stalk of corn in the middle of nowhere. Something like that. And then the last question that Aristotle thought we should ask is about the final cause. And here's the part where it seems perhaps a little bit different from a lot of prevalent scientific thinking of the time. And that is, what is the ultimate purpose of that thing? Aristotle thought that everything in the world served not just a purpose, but a unique purpose that only that thing could serve. Excuse me. Now, obviously a lot of people still believe this, but there's obviously a lot of people who say, no, a lot of this is just random, and things that are useful persist, things that are not die off eventually, right? Very romantic view of the world and the universe. But Aristotle was a very firm believer that everything had ultimately a final cause, that it was destined to become. Now, this is tied up with two more concepts that I really want to make it a point to point out here with Aristotle. And the first is entelechy, which is an ancient Greek word, and it's spelled like this in your book. Not necessarily how you would think of to spell entelechy. Now, it's an ancient Greek word, and I'm not giving you an ancient Greek word here because I hate you, and, I want you to learn ancient Greek, which is a dead language, by the way, but because we don't have an English translation. We're going to see some ancient Greek words here. You're going to learn a couple of German words, a couple of French words, some Latin stuff. And philosophers are pretentious, that's part of it. But a lot of it is just because we don't have a direct translation. And those of you that know multiple languages probably know that sometimes it can take you an entire sentence in one language to explain a word in another. So, entelechy. So here's what it is. It's described sort of the inner drive which helps something become what it's supposed to be. So essentially, if everything has a final cause, if everything has an ultimate purpose, which is special and unique to whatever that thing is, then how does it get there? So the efficient cause sort of tells us what sets it in motion, but there's a lot to happen between, right? So the efficient cause of me is that my parents got together and decided to have children and made babies, but there's a lot that has to happen between that efficient cause of conception and the final cause of fulfilling my destiny as a human, right? There's a lot in between those events. So, what is it that helps me achieve that destiny? Well, that's where entelechy comes in. Now, it seems weird to say like the inner drive because this applies to like plants and stuff too. And it's not like Aristotle thought that there was like a little cheerleader inside an acorn that was like, you can do it, go team, right? Until it turned into an oak tree. This is probably the most similar to our concept of DNA. Although Aristotle would have had no language to be able to express it in those terms and no way to think of it in those terms. But I think that's probably the most similar. And here's why. So imagine you're Aristotle and science is pretty much non existent. And there's not really any sort of methodology. And up until now, people have been talking to oracles and praying to the gods and just sort of making stuff up to try to explain their world. Well, think of being a person that believes that physical objects behave in a predictable physical ways in accordance to physical laws. Well, I look at an acorn and I know that it can only ever be an oak tree. It might not if it doesn't fall in rich soil, if there's too much or not enough water or sunlight, right? A lot can go wrong. But if it succeeds, its only option is oak tree. It's not going to become a palm tree. It's not going to become a avocado tree. It's not going to end up being a fern or a bush or a dog, right? Its only option is oak tree. Cats only have kittens. They don't give birth to any other sort of animal species. Same thing with humans. So if you are having really no knowledge of how DNA works or photosynthesis or any of these sorts of things, you still can notice this. So you have to come up with a way to explain why is it that acorns only become oak trees and why is it that cats only have kittens and things like this. Well, that's where entelechy comes in. There's something that is a physical thing that's inside all physical objects that help it achieve the final cause. It helps it reach its ultimate purpose. Now, the purpose is going to depend on the object. Obviously, the purpose of a man-made object would be to drink coffee out of or whatever you want to put in a drinking vessel. Whereas the purpose of corn is maybe subsistence for humans or animals. The purpose of wind is maybe to distribute seeds or the tides or whatever the explanation might be. So entelechy is what helps something achieve its final cause. But we're not guaranteed to achieve it. So in the same way that some acorns don't grow into oak trees, some cats never have kittens, or any other animal species, but, right, we can fail in our final imperative as well. So it's not guaranteed that we'll achieve our ultimate final cause, even with entelechy helping drive us to that end. So, what is the final cause of humanity? Excellent question. This is essentially asking, what is the meaning of life? What is our purpose? What is the best lived life overall? And this is no easy question to answer. So here's Aristotle's answer, and feel free to agree or disagree with it all you want, but please understand what he meant by it. So Aristotle thought that for humanity, our own special, unique, final cause was another Greek word I'm going to show you, eudaimonia, which is spelled, you have a little definition here in a box on the side. Another ancient Greek word, which is often translated as happiness, which is a terrible translation. A better one would be a well-lived, flourishing life. It's essentially humanity realized to its highest potential. It's our final cause, and not everybody's going to get there. Now, how do we achieve eudaimonia? That's, again, how do we live our lives the best way? What's the meaning of our life? What's our purpose here? how do I live the best life that I can? Well, Aristotle thought it had to be a combination of things. He's going to reject a lot of answers for the best sort of life that were popular then and that are still popular now. He's going to say it can't really rely on money because wealth is only instrumentally valuable. So money is only useful if you can use it to buy other things. So if I give you $1 million, but it's Monopoly money, it's worthless unless we're playing Monopoly because you can't use it for anything. It doesn't matter if you're a millionaire in fake currency because that's not useful. That's not valuable. That's not going to give you a better life because you can't spend it on anything. So it's not way that money is that valuable. It's that money gives us a lot of different things that we can buy. It gives us security. It gives us freedom. It gives us options. It gives us comfort and luxury, all sorts of things. But those things are only valuable insofar as we think that they are. And obviously, we're not all on the same page as to the most useful way to use money. So I was going to say, it can't be money because there's nothing in and of it, currency itself that's particularly valuable. And rich people figured out a long time ago that money isn't enough by itself to make you happy. Anyways, if it was, movie stars would make one movie, get a paycheck for however many $1 million, and then just chill out for the rest of their lives because that money would be enough and they would be happy. That's not what happens. Obviously, every time I see somebody like Samuel L. Jackson in a credit card commercial, I'm thinking, how does he not have enough money? He's in like every movie. He still has to do these commercials, right? Clearly, there's not like an income threshold where you're like, all right, I'm good. I'm happy now forever, right? That doesn't happen. So it can't be money. Similarly, Aristotle's going to say it can't be fame, which is a big goal for a lot of people. The internet, I think, has made that way worse, and I don't understand why. I think being famous sounds horrible, but to each their own. But Aristotle's going to say that's not our ultimate final cause. That's not our eudaimonia, because fame depends on other people. As soon as other people are over you and stop caring about you, your fame is gone. And if we're talking about reaching your fullest potential as a human, that can't be something that just falls in the hands of a passing fancy, especially with as short as our attention spans are in that regard now. So if it's going to be a well-lived life, that's something that you need to be able to control, not something that's going to be dependent on everybody else. So it's not going to be fame. It's also not just going to be happiness or pleasure. That's a part of it too, but that can't be all of it. So if somebody did nothing but sit in their parents' basement and smoke pot and eat pizza and play video games all day, they might be really, really happy, but it would be weird to say that that was their highest potential if they just did that their whole life. They never tried to learn anything new. They never tried to contribute to society. They never interacted with any other humans in any way. It would be hard-pressed for us to say that that was a well-lived, flourishing life that reached their highest potential as a human. So it can't just be about pursuing happiness or pleasure. Not to mention, a lot of people derive happiness or pleasure from harming others. And if you're a serial killer, even if you're super happy about it, we're probably not going to say that's a well-lived life either. So that brings us to the next thing. What about virtue? Now you get a little bit here on Aristotle's ethical viewpoints. There were a lot more that he had. But perhaps being a virtuous person is the best way to live your life. Well, Aristotle's actually going to agree with what we've seen a lot of people say, including Socrates and Buddha and Confucius and Lao Tzu, and that is a life of moderation is the best life of all. So it's important to be virtuous, but if you're so virtuous that you deny yourself of every pleasure, if you're so virtuous that you never do something selfish to make yourself happy or feel better, we probably aren't going to say that that was the best lived life, right? We might find it admirable, but it definitely doesn't seem to necessarily be flourishing in the way that we think perhaps a more well-balanced life would be. So all of these things are going to be important, but there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. Instead, it's all going to be about the balance, hitting the mark, between the extremes. So again, the same piece of advice that we've seen from everybody pretty much, Eastern and Western, in the ancient world. The best lived life is not the one where we get everything we want, not the one where we have all the money and fame and, whatever else, happiness. It's avoiding the extremes. So it's bad to be cheap and to never be generous with what you have, whether it's time or money or skills or whatever. But it's also bad to be the opposite of stingy on the other side and to just give away everything to the point where you can't even take care of yourself anymore, to the point where you're totally burnt out, to the point where you're not even a functioning individual anymore because everything is just given to others. That's not a good life either. The healthiest is to be in the middle. Same thing with courage. It's not a good thing to be a coward. That's certainly not a good way to live your life. But it's also not good to be foolhardy and to act like an idiot. So it's bad if you're so cowardice that you're never going to stand up for yourself or others. You're never going to take a chance. You're just never going to leave your house because you're so afraid. But it's also bad to just be an idiot. Like, I'm just going to run into that burning building in case there's somebody in there, even though I have no reason for thinking that there's anybody in there. Right? That's not admirable. That's stupid. I'm just going to jump out of this plane without a parachute. Right? That's not admirable. That's stupid. So instead, courageous. Right? Part of that is the intelligence and the wisdom of knowing when to have courage and when not to. When to stand up and fight and defend yourself and others. When to take a chance and when not to. And that's not always easy to know. Now, a lot of this, our ability to be virtuous and to find the middle path, is going to depend on our circumstances and our upbringing. Money's not enough to make you happy, but it's a lot harder to achieve eudaimonia if you're in a third world country and you don't really have the luxury of thinking very far beyond where your next meal is coming from. Now, some people misinterpret this and say that Aristotle says that, like, you can't be happy if you're poor. And that's because people who translate eudaimonia as happiness, and then people say, he's saying, oh, you can't be happy if you're poor. Clearly, if you've ever met somebody from a lower income bracket, you know that that's false. And if you go to third world countries, quite often they're probably the happiest, most grateful people you'll ever meet. And it's an incredibly humbling experience to make you hate yourself and your American privilege, for sure. But the idea is living up to the highest potentiality as a human. And if the majority of your time is just spent trying to make enough money, go hunting, get enough resources, whatever, to put food on the table, to keep your heat on in the winter, and to keep a roof over your head and clothes on your children, you don't really have enough time or luxury to be able to live up to your fullest potential when survival is sort of the base. Similarly, if I'm born into an evil time period and an evil majority, like Nazi Germany, for example, it's a lot harder to become a virtuous person when all of your role models in education are telling you that very vicious things are virtuous. Yes, there were people in Nazi Germany that thought Nazism and the Holocaust were wrong. But a lot of them thought that it was right because they were taught that it was right, and they trusted the people who taught them that morality. So if you're born into a society that is maybe a little bit backwards about what is morally appropriate, it's a lot harder to be a morally good person, according to Aristotle. So, our entelechy is what drives us towards, as humans, our final cause, which is, as humans, eudaimonia, a well-lived, flourishing life. Now, notice that for Aristotle, this was essentially a one-size-fits-all package. It wasn't that you get to choose whatever your flourishing life is. You get to choose what your highest potential would be. You get to choose what version of your life is the best and the most well-lived. Aristotle's not really going to allow for that sort of individuality. And that right there is going to bother a lot of people who think the ultimate goal is to be yourself and live up to your own personal standards. And I am fiercely committed to independence and personal identity above any sort of status quo, fitting in with the crowd sorts of lifestyles. But it's undeniable that we do place value judgments on other lifestyle choices. And it does seem like, as much as we want to say that people should be free to live however they want, that we look at certain lives and say, that was a very well lived life. Whether it's an artist you enjoy, like Prince or David Bowie, since they both died recently, as well lived lives. Whether it's somebody who donated their life to a cause, like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or Gandhi or somebody like that. Whatever it is, we certainly can look at some lives like that and say those were well lived, and then look at the life of a serial killer or I don't know, somebody who just took advantage and mooched off of their friends and family forever without ever really applying themselves to anything, and we can say that that wasn't as well lived. Now, I don't know if we should do that. I don't know if we have a right to do that, but if you're going to say everybody's free to determine their own eudaimonia, then keep in mind that you can't make value judgments like that on other people's decisions if they're free to determine their own path to eudaimonia. So it's up to you what you think about this. Obviously, a lot more could be said about Aristotle, but I apologize. I've already talked way longer than I intended to, but I hope this helps explain the chapter and give you more of an appreciation for Aristotle and his contributions to our society.